Good evening, televiewers. You're welcome to today's edition of Prime on my Media Prime, the first edition for this week that is going to run from today to Friday. Every day from 7 p.m. we're going to be bringing you topical issues to discuss, to enlighten and shed a light on some of the things that are touching on our national, continental, as well as global life. This evening, we're going to be looking at the relationship between Africa and the world as we ponder on the declining influence of the West, France in particular, in Africa. We are asking the question as to whether China and Russia actually presents themselves as better alternatives to Africa. We all know how African nations have been so bitter vis-a-vis the relationship, partnership that has existed amongst Africa, Europe and America, a relationship that has been described by many observers as purely exploitative. What has Russia and China got to offer? Is there any difference from what has been happening with the European and American partners who have been working with the African continent for so many years? We are discussing this this evening with Dr. Michael Ndimancho, who is a lecturer here in Cameroon. Good evening, Doctor. We're glad to have you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Leo, and good to meet all the Cameroonians and Africans, and my special regards, especially those who were caught in the skirmishes, let me call it that way, an incident that happened in Buea early morning, and we pray that people may observe some restraint. You know, it appears as if the more we think that there's calm, the more we get this kind of issues happening again. So I'm expressing my sympathy to those who lost, at least the person lost his life and those who lost property, and we pray that we may gradually come to our reasoning and not just create issues because we want to be heard. Thank you so much for inviting me.
We also in the company of Dr. Ako John Ako, who is also a lecturer. We're glad to have you this evening with us, Doctor.
Yeah, Mr. Leonard, it's a pleasure. Once more again, we are talking Africa, Cameroon, and why not the world at large. Africans have been caught in a web. And as usual, the First and the Second World War were created in Europe but fought in Africa. Today, it's economic tussle, military tussle, and even politically. Today, the West are like pushed to another end because of the rise of what they call the BRICS, Britain, Russia, Brazil, Russia, India, and even China. They have been thinking that it is a new breed for them to equally come to the same continent, Africa, that is looked upon as a continent that is made at the mercy of world economic and geopolitical positioning. So to what extent this is of interest to Africa, we tend to know, and to others who think that Russia is more of an angel than the enemies they have been living with. It is far from all this.
Okay. We also in the company this evening of Dr. Richard Munang, who is the Deputy Regional Director of the United Nations Environmental Program. He's working out there in Kenya, but we'll be participating from Canada this evening. Good evening to you, Doctor. We're glad to have you.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Leo, and to the panelists, Dr. Ndimancho and Dr. Ako, and to all the viewers. It's a great opportunity to participate in this very interesting and timely conversation on aspects that could reshape and remake Africa, positively or negatively. And I look forward to the debate.
Okay, we are going to be looking at this, Dr. Michael Ndimancho. When you look at what is happening with Africans' disposition to working with either Europe, America, or the East, can we conclude that Africans nations are becoming wiser with their choice of who to deal with?
Yes, they are becoming wiser, as you said, Mr. Leo. You know, at one moment, especially after the World War II, when Charles de Gaulle introduced what we call the France-Afrique, and which came again with an attachment which came with the Colonial Pact and all of those, Africa, especially the Francophone Africa, had only one choice. They had only one partner, which was that colonial master, France, to deal with at that particular moment. There was this policy of non-interference, and the world was rather divided, and the countries, the colonial countries or Western world, they respected the boundaries of who owned who in the world. You remember that France was here in Africa predominantly. You had America that was in the Middle East and all those. So the world was like, it was divided, and people respected the boundaries of this division. Now, as the world, as things have gone by and years have gone by, you realize that Africans are gradually becoming, detaching themselves from that, what they call that France-Afrique, those colonial pacts that they had, and they now begin to think that they have another choice to fall in love, let me call it that way, to fall in love with other Western powers. We have seen recently China, the influence of China in Africa, and the influence of Russia too in Africa. When you look at actually China coming in, China is coming in to exploit the weakness of the French and the British in Africa. And the African nations are beginning to look at those weaknesses and begin to look at what China is presenting. Remember that China is coming in with a lot of healthy loans to give to African countries. China is coming with a lot of cheap labor in Africa. We have heard of a lot of money being borrowed in the Exim banks and all of those. So China is exploiting the weaknesses of France and America that have already been predominantly operating in Africa in order to lure, these African countries to come toward them. And you also see countries like Russia that is also coming in, powerful, though in terms of the military. Russia is also trying to create an impression in Africa. And what is that impression? You know of what they are having in Ukraine, and Russia thinks that Africa is becoming a partner, that if you support him, it means that after the world is going to regard him as a really strong country in the world. And therefore, nobody is leaving it, untouched. You even remember, America too is coming in. We only talk about Russia and China. America too is in. Remember, after the 9/11 attack in America, one of the things that Americans did is that they exploited that unfortunate situation and sent forth military across Africa, and they said they were trying to actually fight terrorism. But we have seen that even the fight against terrorism is not really that fight against terrorism. They have exploited that opportunity to be able to exploit Africa to the fullest in their own way. And China too, we know of their military base in Djibouti, and that has been there. Russia too has been negotiating with Sudan to have a military base in the coast of the Red Sea. And so most of these people, they have understood that Africa has an economic potential. Instead of talking about the France-Afrique, I remember Macron, that was in Benin, who rather than talking about France-Afrique, now said it is now France-Africa. It's no more France-Africa, but France-Africa, whatever that means. And he used a statement. He said, Africa is now globalized. And those who understood that diplomatic language understood that from Macron having to, admitting that when the issue of colonialism happened, he was not yet born, and that he, as somebody who is, after that colonial era, is going to stamp out that issue of neo-colonialism that France is starting on Africa. And I think it is now like everybody is looking at Africa as a partner because of the potential that they have. We are going to look at some of the loopholes that we have as African, because in the early years of colonialism, it was the West that came to Africa, took away the strong men, the intelligent men in Africa, exploited our land. But now it is even us at this time that we are luring the West to come to Africa because of what we have. And I think that we really need to make great use of what we have as the land, and then as the resources that we have, even the human resources that we have. There are great potentials in Africa, and we really have to exploit to the fullest.
Okay, you are reading of the way things are turning out in Africa with respect to its relationship with the world, because formerly, especially French African nations did so much business with France, but we see what is happening with some of the French African nations, Mali, Guinea, behind us, Central African Republic. What is happening? Is Africa finally taking its destinies into its hands, or they're just confused, moving according to the wind?
Yeah, one of the things we need to know is that after colonization, in fact, before France decolonized Africa, a lot of agreements were made. And once you have signed an agreement, there is that need to protect and hold them, and that any party that is at the stretch of violating one of the acts becomes punishable. And the person who imposes such conventions or agreement is the same person that imposes the sanctions. A lot of Africans have been thinking that they have been suffering. In fact, Francophone Africa, that have been suffering heavily from the hands of French rule, and which preaches that nothing good can come from an African, that eating French food, dressing like the French man, and even living in Paris and schooling in Marseille or Sorbonne is just the only thing which Africans can have. If you look at today, a lot of French Africans still believe that using French goods and eating French bread against Africans' meal is what makes them more civilized. A type of education which they had received from when they were born to. Even the system of education which goes on in our schools today. We have been taught how to grow palm oil, grow cocoa, grow coffee, grow palms, rubber, and even bananas, even when the local industry is unable to transform either of these products or the products servicing the interests of the Africans. To what interest these things were done, many thought it was to help Africans, but these were simply farms for European industries, and they continue serving this interest even after what we call independence, which is a pseudo independence. In his life, it does not represent anything. Africans are thinking that with the conflict presently in Europe for a stand of power who will dominate, the Chinese on the other hand, and the Europeans and the Americans on the other, it is time for them to reposition. But it will be very poor for us to think that either of those people will come to help or to liberate Africa. I have not seen any country in Africa that has been liberated by the Europeans, starting with what the South Africans call the apartheid. To what extent the Russian helped them to liberate or to come off apartheid was just a machinery or a mercy of heaven. Now, to some extent, we think that the French, like we have seen in recent days, are under stress because somewhere the Russians have presented a military force. The only option which the Russians have now to impose in the world is military gain. To what extent that will profit Africa? This will profit Africa. Will it not lead to other regeneration of an extended crisis? Agreements are made, we are not told. Russians obviously might not be coming and giving us arms and fighting another enemy for free. If that is free, we need to see such agreement, and how free it is what we need to know. We have a lot of interest in all camps. Africans might be robbing Peter today to pay Paul tomorrow. To what extent Paul will be better as against Peter remains a very huge uncertainty. We might be happy today because some of us are equally so motivated and elated, thinking that the Russians are better. We have brandished their flags. We have even burned the flags of some Western nations, even when the same clothes you are wearing and the shoes you are wearing are coming from such nations. Even when such brothers and sisters to bring in a lot of colonial debts that were taken to this country, they work in their plantation and bring home a lot of revenue. That we can never think, I, for one, believe that Africans can only be liberated if they have what I call the moral and the mental consciousness of the whole nation. Have we asked what several leaders in Africa have stayed in power for 40 and 50 years, what accountability have they rendered to their people, while they still render the same accountability to the West? Are we going to stop? Because today we see there is a Sino-African summit, there is a Russo-African summit. These are forums and fora where these people develop strategies to continue harnessing, harassing, and threatening your own very survival. To what extent was the Berlin Conference different from the Sino-African agreement? And many debts forgiveness, which comes only after you have paid heavily. Just imagine, I was talking of the PB computers for over 75 billion. It is the amount of money another country used to build a whole university. But we have signed with one of the BRIC members. Many did not even know how the money was transferred to the person who sent the computer to us, when it was taken, and for how much, to what rate of interest that money was given. We have signed this particular convention with China. To what extent China and Russia will come to liberate Africa is very huge. The uncertainty is simply the fact that we are fighting another person. But how good is the new partner? It gives a lot of more liberty. It's what we might be seeking, but not for violence. Africans can simply, and they are free to make new friends. But if it become a violent nature of such relationship, it is what we will not agree. The liberation which we are crying, morally or mentally, should come in the atmosphere of not only treating Westerners or Southerners or Northerners, but equally our own people. Have Africans themselves stopped killing their own brothers without even the instruction of the West and the North? We need to check well how many wars we have fought against ourselves, as against how many wars we have fought with the West. Is the solution from China or the BRICS or from the Americans and the Europeans? If not, then the problem might be far. Changing the alternative of Russia or China or South Africa or Brazil or India is simply just putting different color or a wolf in a sheep clothing.
Okay, wolf in sheep clothing. Dr. Munang, I have an article you published recently. It says that the recent announcement by Russian President Vladimir Putin that Moscow has written off more than $20 billion debts from African states presents both opportunities and challenges for Africa. And you presented some of the good and bad points. Where do you situate Russia in this mix? We know that China has been here, but Russia has been making inroads. Is Russia the angel that many Africans believe it to be?
Yeah, thanks again, Mr. Liu, and thanks to the panelists, Dr. Ndimancho and Dr. Ako, who have already put in perspective a very solid grounding to this very crucial topic. So let's put it this way. They say if you close your eyes to facts, you will learn through accidents. And this is an African proverb. And I think before I get to the depth of answering your question, recently what we've seen is that a few weeks ago, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, India, came together actually to start discussing how they can be able to come up with a common currency for trade. And in the last quarter of 2022, the International Monetary Fund did show that at least the dollar as a unified currency for trading actually fell by 59%. So the point is, if there is going to be a currency, is there any African country that can actually be able to hold that up or host it? And the answer is very clear that the continent seems sometimes to be looking at misplaced priorities. And I call them so intentionally because if you are able to have partners, either it is any country in the world, without you having your internal strategy, then that partner will just be as good as it can be. And more importantly, the writing of debt is just one aspect. The truth is that what is Africa's strategy towards any partner in the world? That should be the bigger question. And either dead or not, written off should be what is Africa itself doing as a continent with a lot of abundance in terms of resources. And when you look at the debt that was written off, it was written off through the lens of aid and through the lens of benevolence, which is not good to the extent that the continent could actually be able to generate that was written off just from one sector, agriculture. Let's take agriculture, for example. The continent today imports food worth over $43 billion each and every year. Yet it is a continent that have over 65% of uncultivated arable land and loses food worth $48 billion. So when you wait for partners to write off your debt, without you actually leveraging internal opportunities to tap opportunities with partners, then it is just as good as can take. Then to the point of what is Africa supposed to actually do, whether debt was written off or not, is actually to do three things. The first is to foster a strategy that looks internally to then be able to leverage on her citizens so that at least they can be able to tap into partners to fill gaps where they are unable to fill. If you take the agro sector, still again, where the continent only produces 20% of the food that is required. It only adds value to 20%. 80% is imported. Can the continent start looking at how can they add value so that at least partners should actually be a trading market for them to export? The second aspect is that as we're speaking today, Africa doesn't lack policies or what is required. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade, where 54 African countries have actually signed up to. 46 countries as we speak today have ratified. But unfortunately, only 8 countries actually trade with one another. And globally, Africa is the only continent on earth that doesn't trade with herself. So to look at partners only externally, to then make the case that it is important or not, to me is a misplaced priority and less strategic strategizing to seize opportunities in the globe. Opportunities are in Africa, and Africa is only trading less than 12% with herself. It therefore means instead of only focusing on our external partners, Africa should look at our own partners, which are our fellow African countries, and see how they can be able to tap into opportunities. The last aspect, which I think is very, very important, is that if you look at what Dr. Ndimancho said, if you take Djibouti, which is actually an example that we need to use, they have both the Chinese outpost and the American outpost. I don't necessarily think that it was America that influenced or it was the West. It was the internal decision, and they all know what they gain out of this. So if the broader question should be, the fact that it is the West or Russia or China coming to Africa is going to benefit Africa, to me, it's not going to benefit unless Africa actually know what they want to tap from this. Look at the loans that are given to the African continent today, strategically leveraged to then help the continent to add value. I guess it's as good as mine. And we are discussing these issues at a very timely moment, because if the continent does not re-strategize, then definitely they will lose opportunities that they will never ever get. So why do I say so? Just 1 minute. We are now moving towards a shift called the green transition, or the low carbon pathway transition. And the world is shifting towards tapping into these strategic, what is called critical minerals. And these critical minerals, 85% of them are in the African continent, chromium, lithium, and you name it, that is going to be producing what we call e-mobility, electric vehicles, wind, solar system. These are in Africa, but Africa is not strategizing on how they can add value so that at least they can increase the market value of these minerals. Only waiting for partners without necessarily defining what partner can come and do so that it is a win-win. You only end up falling rather than leading. Over.
Yes, Doctor, I want you to provide an answer to Julius Chofo, who is writing from the United Kingdom. He says that, is it not a sign of the fundamental weakness of Africa that we cannot exploit the huge competition by these world powers to our advantage? He says, can your panel suggest some practical ways in which African countries should exploit this modern-day scramble for Africa? Julius Chofo, how do we catch into this scramble where these guys are struggling to woo us? It's like you want to get the best lady around, you have to throw some peanuts. Oh, I don't know, you use the best methods possible to attract the lady to yourself. China is doing same. Russia is there. France has been doing that for so long, as well as America. How do we tap into that and then make maximum benefit for the African continent?
I think it's quite very straightforward. Let's not discuss as if Africa is starting from scratch. When it comes to what Africa actually needs, it is on paper. We have the African Union Agenda 2063 that actually intends to create the Africa we want by ensuring that Africa leverages its own opportunities to create opportunities for our citizens and countries. Is there. Then we have the Africa Continental Free Trade, which is that as a continent, which is over 54 countries with a net worth of these trading up to about $3.4 trillion US, Africa can come together, trade among herself, and trade with partners. The issue is operationalization and moving from just paper to action, which then entails governments to then be able to see we have the opportunity and this is how we're supposed to see. To answer this question very practically, it's not just countries or Africa, because Africa is not a country. Africa is a collection of 54 African countries. Each country do have bilateral trade, because we cannot just talk about the West or partners without also talking about trade. And I did say Africa trade with herself less than 20%, 12% to be exact. And at the same time, Africa actually export employment and import unemployment because they don't add value. So the best thing for Africa to do is to say, look, if you have 65% of uncultivated level arable land, same time you lose 48 billion because of post-harvest losses, is to start saying, I need to start adding value to my products, and I cannot be able to export any raw materials because you are exporting employment and then importing unemployment. Difficult to do. And so any trading partner will not be able to get raw materials from Africa. These can be done at country level. The second aspect is you can only go to war with the army you have, as Donald Rumsfeld once said, which Africa's army is a youth, and not only in terms of fighting one another, but in terms of retooling their skills so that they can be prepared to be able to tap into the opportunities. You will not have value in food just by talking. You need young people to be able to show that they can turn cassava into flour. They can be able to turn the cassava into flour, into bread, and into finished products so that at least it is exported to fetch a higher price. And that means that the continent needs to start reshaping its educational system right down to the local level, by ensuring that even at a vocational level, skills to add value to what the country have in abundance. If you take Cameroon, it's an agrarian country, producing agriculture with over 65% of the entire population employed in the agro sector. Do we have young people who add value to banana, to potatoes, to sweet potatoes, to cassava? That is, if France or Belgium or China comes and wants to export 200 tons of cassava, will it be done in finished products? No. The point therefore means that agreements must be, it should be finished products that need to be exported. The last aspect is a very important one, which is that trade needs to become the engagement point with each and every partner country, which will then mean that the countries are not just coming in to give benevolence in terms of aid or in terms of writing of debt, but to then be able to pick up what the country is advantageous with in terms of what it produces. And that is how you can then be able to strategize yourself to partner with a country so that at least the buyer already finished, the citizens will make money because they're adding value to it. The country will to grow the economy from a transformational and from a competitive perspective. This and focusing only on benevolence and aid will only leave Africa to be a begging bowl to the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's look at Africa and the world today. Doctor, you come in, and then the both doctors with me on this platform. Africa wants to assert itself, yet we find Africa engaging with Africa, France Africa summit, US Africa summit, and now we are embracing Africa China summit. We are embracing Africa Russia summit. Is there any sense of wanting to move away from our old habits when France, Russia, now China and America are seeing us not as nations, but seeing a continent as a nation? Mm-hmm.
That's right. And you're very correct. And I think that Dr. Richard perfectly put it in context. Because to compete with anyone, you must be at a certain level or having something that someone envies. Mm-hmm. And you are able, authoritatively, financially, to be able to put a string on it, so that that person getting that what you have, is high rate of negotiation. And because when we talk today about the globalization, and then Africa sits and they're also singing the issue of globalization, and you ask yourself, what is Africa standing to sell in the global market? What is Africa standing to compete with other countries? So you now see that the foreign countries are only coming and trying to maybe deceive us to feel that we are at the same level with them. Now, you say something very, very important, because we are still seeing some countries which are at the level of authority and Africa remaining at the level of solidarity. It means that what? We are standing at that level whereby we are standing and looking at somebody up and thinking that that person is still a savior, that is without him we cannot survive. How would we be talking of Russia Africa summit, talking of China Africa summit, instead of talking of China Cameroon summit, Russia Cameroon summit, we are talking of Russia Africa summit? It doesn't make any sense. And as we said, the only way in which we can impose ourselves is the first and foremost economical. I think that Kwame Nkrumah talked about we having a political independence first, but I think that that political independence was taken into consideration, and it has not helped us. And even the issue of apartheid in South Africa was that issue of political independence. You gain political independence and you deprive the people of economic independence. The thing is that Africa must rise up. First, you must be able to produce something that you yourself will put a price tag. Now, when you look at, for example, let's take a country like France. France has corporations in Africa. You hear of Bolloré in Africa, in Cameroon. You hear of Total in Africa, in Cameroon. And they impose in these domains. Africans are not able to compete with them. But you find we are producing things. Dr. Richard talked about issue of cassava. You produce cassava or you produce cocoa and you sell it to the world market. It is somebody else who puts a price tag. Who tells you that you are supposed to sell this cocoa in this amount? How do you want to compete with somebody who tells you how much you should sell what you produce? That cannot work. So the best thing that Africans have to do is to be able to produce and process what they are producing and to put their price tags and be able to tell the world that this is what we have and this is the price that we are putting on it. That is the only way in which the other countries can be able to fall down. You said even in terms of human labor, we have gone too low. When you even look at black consciousness movement that they sang them up and down, and you find at the end of it all, we only infantilize ourselves. We think that Europe is the El Dorado, that we have to take everything. What is it that we cannot conceive something in Africa and let Europe already they are envying Africa? The raw materials, they are envying. Even in terms of labor force, they are envying Africa. That is why most in Africa, when companies come to Africa, they grow very big because the labor force is cheap and they are competent. I think that we have to build ourselves. Richard also talked about free trade. How do you think that you will live and you open free trade with France or with Europe, and in your own African continent, before I leave here and go to Gabon, I need actually a visa? There are a lot of strings tied to trade within countries in Africa. You cannot leave Africa and go and produce that kind of a free trade or that kind of a cordial relationship with somebody who is miles and thousands away from you, and your next neighbor who, if something happens, is the first to cry foul and to condemn and to alert you. You do not trade with the person. In terms of transportation, moving in Africa, we should be able to move freely and discuss business with our own Africa. It is only when we are united. You look at the European Union. I think that there's a lot to learn from the European Union, and the African Union has to stand tall in terms of this. Africans, the Europeans, China, Russia are coming to Africa and profiting from the wars and the crisis that we have in Africa. And they are even the one who are promoting this crisis in order to make our borders porous, in order to fragilize our environment and then come in and take our raw material. This is where we have to stand tall. And that the only way we can stand tall is that we have to be able to create a cordial relationship and to be able to trade with countries freely. I think that this is something we have not achieved, and we have to get to that. Free trade, globalization is about an economic power. You selling what you have and buying what you do not have, and you competing with somebody. How do you stand to compete with somebody that you do not know? That is why we keep on jumping from one partner in Europe, from one partner in China, one partner in Russia. But I usually tell Africans that you do not run away from frost land to find yourself in mud. You should be very careful. You don't run from the stream to go and fall in the sea. We need to have strategies. Africans have great minds, intellectuals. You have people.
But you say that we have great minds. Now, we would understand that, okay, we came out of independence, we were not very strong. That is why we could, as a continent, do trading with France as a nation, Africa, European Summit, the US also, and maybe China to some extent, and Russia. But today, more than 60 years after, we are still being received in China as a nation. We find heads of states from different nations rushing down to China, being received by President Vladimir Putin, who is announcing that he is cancelling African debts. He's not cancelling African debts, and then the continent is celebrating.
Yeah, Mr. Leonard, it simply comes to conclude or to confirm the idea that Africa has always been looked at the rest of the, in fact, visioned from the rest of the international community as a single nation. It's a single nation, and what they have are simply quarters and maybe villages that make up the continent. When you look at the fight today, somebody will tell you, if you take at the European map, you look at the size of Russia, when we call Russia as a country, look at the size of China, as we are talking here, scribe or zoom the map, you look at what they call India, you realize that 2 or 3 of these particular countries are more than the continent of Africa. So that gives the mindset which they have. And many Africans too, whom we call them leaders, have been lobbyists.
But why don't they do that with European nations?
Yeah, that is what I'm telling you, that if we look at that, when you look at the African idea, and that we are always going to be servants, that wherever we sit on tables in international, there's what they call international order, that was set far from where we are. The agreements that created the United Nations, I have not seen any African country in such an agreement establishing the United Nations. Africans were simply called to be lured into an agreement which they were not part. That is why in most of the United Nations strategic agencies, it will be difficult for you to find an African. And lying down where you find at the level like the Secretary General Kofi Annan, who later served that particular institution, it was equally to tell Africans that you're in power. But when you look at sensitive places like the Security Council, we are talking again here that the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal, Africans were simply called to sign and accept the premises of such institution. We have a lot within. When you look at America, when loans are given to Africa, you have talk of the highly indebted poor country initiative. It was not led from one country. A lot of countries in Africa were considered poor and placed under that particular banner. And later too, their debts were forgiven after a particular target was attained. So Russia, to using this period, they know it's very strategic. Looking at what is going on, Russia, Ukraine, many Africans have become sympathizers. People sympathize with the Russian bloc, telling you that 60 years ago, we have been intimidated by the French. That's what they use. We have been intimidated. We have been cheated. Nobody knows in which domain, like Richard said, where the Russians are coming to help us. Nobody even knows what we are going to benefit from China. I said, just an example, you know of the 75 billion debt over computers. And we don't, no Cameroonian, if you know how the money was borrowed and how it went back to the person who supplied us the computer, at what rate, we have not even answered the question. But we left here to take a loan that way. Of what importance is that? Africans, I said, repeating with what Professor Pro Lumumba said, that until Africans will learn to be men, they can never sit as equal in the table of civilized nations. I take again example, for those who have been 60, 40 years in power, if my own president goes to render an account of a dialogue he has in his own country, it means somebody somewhere gave him instructions for the dialogue. And many, that when you look in the Congo, you look at the position of the president of the Congo, Tshisekedi, after being elected, he need to visit Belgium. Visiting Belgium, he need to go to Russia. Why are they going to Russia? To them, they are opening grounds for more investment. And I asked, what type of investment? For how much and to what extent? What is the content of such investment that we need? We don't even, like Dr. Munang said, we have misplaced priorities. And at times we go just for propaganda, political propaganda, that since Mali has done it, we too will do it. So we use war as an instrument of coming to gain Africa. Is that what we need now? Africans, that's why I said, what Africans need is more mental consciousness than even the physical military weapons that others are placing around their nations. And if we can't understand that we as Africans need to talk first among themselves, that's what they talk of the South-South cooperation. Should I be buying flour from Ukraine when Nigeria announced last week that Zimbabwe has excessive wheat, which is near exportation, but we are buying from Ukraine, which will take us more than any? There is a need for inter-African trade to be strengthened, even politically. When you see ECOWAS act in the situation in the Gambia against Barrow, has that reacted the same when Cameroon has a crisis in the Northwest and the Southwest? Have we seen any CEMAC country that has condemned and said we must settle it? So when we can recognize our own interests, sometime here I told you, when you look at the situation in Turkey, Africans have died and other nations died. Is it the same response these people give to their citizens that African countries have equally given.
Others died. Others died recently also.
Yes, in how they call it, in Antigua. The response other governments give when their citizens are in danger, is it the same response Africans give when their own citizens are in danger? It gives you the level of understanding, because to some people, they can die in the Caribbean, they can die in the ocean, it does not concern us. Imagine an Israelite that is wounded on the streets of Gaza. It will not be the same response that very evening for touching another person like a French. When we see it in Africa, when you took or kidnap one French person in north of Cameroon, you have it on RFI and BBC. But when an African is killed, I mean, in his own country, they are even forbidden to talk about it. Meaning in the northern and southwest, military dies, he goes quiet, and civilians have been killed, he goes quiet. Everybody is afraid to talk about his own country. They will stand here and shout how Russia is an angel and how America is the evil. So we have more interest in what others are doing. We have no interest in strengthening our own moral upbringing. There is a problem with Africa, and if care is not taken, I said we might be leaving a frying pan or a pot to the fire itself. People have to be conscious that we need to respect first ourselves. Why not get into internal trade? Do we even need Europe? There is a time even the AU can tell you that internal solidarity first, the principle of solidarity among us Africans. If I have to buy milk from Britain or Netherlands, I will only do so if Nigeria or South Africa does not produce milk.
Okay.
And that is the strength.
Dr. Munang, I want us to look at what Russia is doing in Africa. Russia is in not far from Cameroon, behind here, Central African Republic. They are in Mali and other West African nations. Strategically, how is Russia helping Africa?
I think before I get to that, I mean, we need to build on these aspects that Dr. Ndimancho and Dr. Ako have brought up. And one of the aspects that Dr. Ndimancho did bring up is that the level of authority and we need to be at the level of authority, not at the level of solidarity. I think this is even at an individual level. If you cannot be able to offer value, people will take you for granted. And that's the starting point. If you cannot, an authority is not given, authority is taken. You take authority based on what you can be able to offer, and then gain the ground to be able then for people to believe and trust you. I think the continent today needs to establish itself as an authority, not only in terms of authority, in terms of seeking for help or support, but authority in terms of what it can offer. And that is where the respect will come. And so this point of being an authority, not just at the point of solidarity, I think is quite very, very important. I think Dr. Ako brought up an aspect of an African idea, which I don't think we should be able to acknowledge, because if we cannot be able to acknowledge where we're coming from, we might not be able to go that far. And acknowledgement is that the African idea of that we were colonized, right? We talk about it as if it was only Africa that was colonized. And it was only 11 countries across the entire world that were not colonized. Even the China we're talking about was colonized by Japan. But today, China economy is 3 to 4 times bigger than that of Japan. So we should not use any example or justification that Africa is where it is today because it was colonized. Nearly every country was colonized and only 11 were not colonized. To your question of what Russia is doing at the backyard or not, here's the point. The engagement with countries bilateral. Let me really stress that point. That's why in any country you go, you will see embassies and ambassadors from different countries. They're not there to sit and just put their flag on their cars to show that they're there. And the reason is interest. And therefore, if you allow someone to come into your own house, Mr. Leo, you allow that person to sit and start sweeping the house or cooking without you actually asking the person what he has come to do in your home, then definitely you are the one to be blamed. And therefore, for us to sit and blame foreign powers or Western countries for coming into Africa sometimes, to me, I always ask the question, personally, where were we at gunpoint to then be able to accept that countries should come in and mine our minerals or cut our timber and go away with it? It was an agreement, and it's a agreement done by African countries, sometimes with understanding what is in those agreements, and then we end up losing. So I think this discussion is very, very important, sometimes not necessarily just to bring up the issues, but to provide what needs to be done. That means that the question should actually be, what do African countries get by engaging in this partnership? To me, I would say they need to look at what is the value they're getting out of it, what is the value they're offering, and at the same time, make sure that at least they play a role of a win-win. Unless you become an authority to say no, then definitely it will always be used. And so, to answer your question very practically, it is a bilateral agreement with a country. Only a country can be able to tell us what they're getting out of it. It is not a decision, because Africa is not a country. Another, in one last point that I think panelists did discuss very excellently, Dr. Ndimancho and Dr. Ako, which is this aspect of Africa-China partnership, Africa, Russia, Africa, Europe, Africa, America. Africa is not a country. The West have recognized a very important aspect that I think Africa should recognize today, which is that for them to trade with all the 54 African countries, it's easy to engage Africa as a collective. But Africans have never had Africa-Africa partnership, Africa summit. It could happen. And I hope those who are listening to this program, tomorrow they should start engaging, and a country should take leadership. Cameroon should take leadership and do this, or Nigeria, or Kenya, or South Africa. Bring all African head of states, business partners across the continent, and discuss bilateral agreements to be able to drive their own. Once they do that, I can tell you, once that happens, time, the calculus of geopolitical engagement in terms of trade will shift immediately. Africa will start to take a different seat at the discussion table, because they will start to recognize that at least Africa have seen the light. Africa looks like they're waking up. They'll become that giant whereby they will start to be respected. The rush to engage Africa will change. But until that happens, what Dr. Ako said will just be like brewing water on a dead.
Okay, Dr. Michael Ndimancho, we are looking at what Africa stands to gain. Why is it very difficult for Africans themselves to work as a unit? We know that the AU exists, but let's take the case of CEMAC, where we say, okay, we have to open our borders, yet very difficult for Africa to work amongst themselves, thereby creating that continent that opens its borders like the Europeans have done for the growth of business between African nations. We rather are very comfortable or rather proud, boasting of having bilateral trade with European nations, with maybe the Asian nations, but very difficult to work amongst ourselves. We are so intolerant towards a Chadian, for the Cameroonian the case, though we have Chadians and Central Africans here, but we see the way Gabon would treat a Cameroonian in Gabon just next door. We see the way Equatorial Guineans would treat Cameroonians, and vice versa. Look at what is happening in South Africa, where blacks don't want to accept. But we are very comfortable to come from our respective nations and then pose in Russia as Africa, pose in China as Africa, when internally things are not going right with us.
That is the problem. It's a lack of, first, there's lack of trust amongst ourselves. We Africans, we are too careful with our own brothers and sisters. Trust is one thing. Second thing, selfishness. We think that we can grow as individuals, which can never work. Cameroon thinks that, okay, it is the breadbasket of the Central African region, and therefore they must be adored. Though he doesn't think that there is this communal, there's something that they have to trade in common, you know, this collaboration that they need to have in order to grow taller. And we forget the fact that in the world of today, you cannot grow alone any longer. We live in a corporate world, and the corporate world is not just about individual businesses. Corporate world is also about trading together as countries in the continent. And that is what gives us the power that people have to be afraid of us. And I first of all talked about the lack of trust. If you remember what has happened in Africa in the past years, you will understand that most African presidents or countries are very, very careful. Look at Libya, what happened in Libya, where African nations, they actually dissociated themselves from their own colleague, African president, from Gaddafi, and allowed Gaddafi to die a shameful death. Nobody came up and openly supported Gaddafi, either for fear or, of being attacked by whoever or none, we don't know. That is one thing. That also sends a call to other African presidents to be careful, to know that if you start something, you are going to end it alone. We have had countries, look at countries, also other countries like Burkina Faso, Sankara, and Blaise Compaoré. All the examples are numerous. There are so many examples that we can quote. But I think that Africans have failed in this perspective. If you follow up the UN General Assembly meeting in New York when it holds, especially maybe in September, whatever, when an African president has to take the floor, the whole hall is empty. He speaks to himself. It is usually a shame. I have taken 2 or 3 times to be able to watch that, and I ask myself, what am I watching? And why is this so? It is so because these very partners, the Europeans, China, Russia, who pretend to be trading you, do not even trust them. They do not even think that they can say anything in the United Nations General Assembly that would be of help to any of them. But they prefer to come behind and treat with them behind. Are they the Joseph or Arimathea, or whoever who was a private a friend of Jesus in secret? I think that they need to be very, very, the African presidents, they need to be able to know this. And one of the other things that we'll have to talk about is the issue of entitlement. There is an issue of entitlement whereby, the African president do not want to be recognized as servant leaders. They don't want to be considered as servant. They think that the people should be grateful to them instead. They think that they have to be, they have to lord it over the people. And this is one of the issues whereby you think an African president do not come in order to serve. He comes to the people, but to serve himself. And he stays there for 40 years and he doesn't even feel. I was following an interview with Yoweri Museveni. He was being interviewed by Al Jazeera, and he was asking him, you have stayed there for 30-something years. The journalists came back to that statement time and time. You have stayed there for 30-something years. Do you think that you still have something to offer? The man said, the more you stay, the more you think that there are a lot of things to do. And the second question was, do you think you are the only one that can do what you think you can do? So you think you are successful and you have no successor? I think that in this case, they have no response. The man thinks that he is the only one to deliver. And they keep on saying, the people have given us the mandate. The people have given us the mandate. Their own Democrats, the people have given them the mandate every day. And that is why they are being voted. And they forget the fact that even these trade partners that are coming, I want to state, for example, Russia. If you see the countries Russia is getting with, their countries are war-torn. Their countries are in crisis. That's why China is coming to sell arms. China is a Judas Iscariot of the partner in Africa. He is coming in to sell arms. China is coming in Nicodemously in Africa into pretending to be a real partner, but it's only coming in to be able to sell arms to these dictators, people who are there illegitimately. And if you see those you are trading with, Central African Republic, you have Ethiopia, you have even Uganda, he has gone there. These are the people he is going around with to sell arms, and they are happy. And people are very happy that they are trading with China. Russia. Russia's, the land space is like, Spain. Yes, it's a small country. And then you come and you think that you will be able to organize a trade or a trade meeting or whatsoever with the whole continent. And the people who are there are happy. Cameroon is not left out. In the face of the war in Ukraine, the Minister of Defense went and signed arms deal with China. And of course, the question was, but why this? They explain, we have been trading with other fellow. Is this what we want? Is it what Cameroon wants at this particular time? Arms? And they come and create those skirmishes, the clashes, the wars in order to sell their arms. We do not have strategies in Africa. I think that we really need to sit up the African presidents themselves, and as I've said, You ask a question why there is no collaboration. The simple reason why there is no collaboration is because each person wants to be regarded as the top class of all the other presidents. It appears as if they themselves are fighting among themselves to see who is the best president, or to see who is the president that is much more frightful or can create more fear in Africa. And so I think that we have the idioms of Africa, and this is what we are creating today. We really need that collaboration. Without that collaboration, there would be no meaningful development in Africa.
Yeah, when we see across the streets of the Democratic Republic of Congo, citizens brandishing Russian flags. We also saw along some of the streets in the Central African Republic where some citizens also were parading with Russian flags. I don't know. Is it to say that Russia developed a part of Asia, or developed a part that would inspire this enthusiasm, this firm belief that a Messiah is finally here, or it is simply out of the hate that Africans have for the West?
Yeah, you should know that Russia, China, and the rest have equally learned the approach of the West. And when you see in places like Congo, Central African Republic, Mali, they have a lot of organization on the ground that have taken a lot of youths into the Steino, Africa, Rousseau, Africa ideology. And the idea why this movement now, when there is a stiff war that is almost dividing the world into two in Ukraine, the guys brought it and they use it again as an opportunity at the same time. Don't be surprised. There is Rousseau African Summit in July. Yes, don't be surprised that maybe you will be one of the partners to present the Russian agenda in Russia. We should not again say maybe you were not there last time because you were not one of the partners. That is what they do. The Russian embassies all around Africa, that is the activities now. How do they raise the youth awareness and what they can do for them? What they can do. They will not tell you what they have done. Because like I told people, I will prefer my brothers who are presently maybe in prison in California, because I know they will eat well, they will sleep well, even as prisoners. But I'm still to see a nation that has been raised, even as a neighbor by Russia. I mean, Russia's own neighbor that has grown from Russian experience. So we are thinking that the youths, likewise the African leaders, what we are saying here, you imagine the youths of those countries are countries which are already at war. So the war has been used as an instrument of manipulation. And that if the Russians will come, they will do us good. We are waiting to see the results of what the Wagner group has been doing already in Mali. We are waiting the result in Central Africa. Maybe in 2 years' time, we want to see how developed Central Africa has become and what the Russians have brought it as investment, and how clearing Bangui. And that to some others, we should equally know that Mali has been divided into two. The northern part of Mali has been ungovernable. And so we are waiting to see how governable is going to come with this. And in Burkina Faso too, we saw those same flags. Russian flags were brandished and Western flags were equally burnt. The African youths with today, some of these countries which have been held under tyranny have been thinking that their liberator is Russia. That is why we are here, saying that there have been a mischief or mistransformation of information. None of these guys is an angel. Everybody has a political, economic, socio-cultural interest. Some time ago, there were no Chinese lessons taught in Cameroon. Today we have Chinese schools now in Cameroon. Nobody is even aware that those who come there to teach that Chinese are Chinese citizens. And if you have to imagine that there are 100 Chinese schools in Africa and we employ just 5 Chinese teachers in those schools, it is 100 times 5. So we have 500 Chinese gaining job in Africa to teach the Chinese language, because people know that it is the next destination. Now that we have signed a convention, one part of it is that in some schools we will be teaching Chinese. We have Confucius Institute teaching Chinese at the University of Yaoundé too. We have them with a lot of partnership in local private schools. This gives us an idea. They are there to sell their culture, and very soon people will be maybe taking Moise Setong's shirt or t-shirt which has been written and brandished in his name, and which will be maybe the cost. So we will not be wearing Kevin Klein we love Moe Zedong. And so it becomes, if not Alibaba, then we abandon Amazons and go for Alibaba shed. So these are some of the ideas which they are carrying forth to us. People are thinking it's for assistance. They have their economic agenda. This will be for their interest. A lot of African youths have been caught in the web. We have marched for parties. We are not even going to vote because the party gave us 2,000 today and the other one will give us 2,000. So when the other party comes, we wear the t-shirt. African youths are used to that. Frustration and lack of opportunities have rendered them as propaganda agents for any political vision. And
but it's not these youths that are bringing, it is the governments.
No, that is what I'm telling you, that when you go there, what you don't see is that a lot of those youths on the streets have been manipulated by the governments in place. Ask yourself, where are the Russian and Chinese flags coming from? Who bought them? And know what Africans can do, and know what an Africa can do with its 1,000 flags.
Are you saying that since China came to Africa, we have not gained? We've not seen marked development in Africa since it came?
What the extent of development is what we are asking. The others too came and developed, but then the type of development and for whose interest that was done is what we are saying. Now the Chinese too equally fry beignet in Douala. What you have not seen with the French and the British, they were not on street frying beignet because a particular sector was reserved for the local people. But now when you have builders, I mean those who put cement and block on bridges coming from China, those who tie the rods, I mean tying of rods, you import labor from China, then think very well that that particular person, in Germany they used to talk of the Lebensraum policy, the living space. When your own country becomes so congested, they start thinking of exporting labor abroad. For whose interest, the same convention you signed, that money, that loan, which they are using to build that bridge, is the one that brought the Chinese to work there. And your own children, who are still bricklayers, carpenters, are at home. Is that a necessary agreement? Is that convention of the development? What technology have we transferred? So we keep on begging them to come and build our schools. So it becomes very difficult for us to adhere somewhere that we might brandish them. I'm just telling you that some people have said that the Chinese example, the Russian example, is not what Africans want. What Africans want is their self-consciousness and moral upbringing that Africans should learn of getting on them. You have just used the example of Equatorial Guinea. They were almost building a wall in Kiosi. They don't want Cameroonians. I mean, an African country, which is your neighbor, doesn't want Cameroonians. Cameroonians want to go to America. And then you are criticizing America, Russia. When you have a small neighboring problem here, Cameroonians have been flogged several times and thrown into small boats to come out at Kribi. And just imagine that. We cannot go to Central Africa. Gabonese don't want to see you. You are an enemy in your own continent. Have you seen that in Europe? So these are some values which we need to have before thinking of fighting or bringing any partner. We need self-recognition among us as Africans.
Now, we've just been joined by you, Tamai Jarvis, but let me just end up with Dr. Richard. Hello, Doctor, let's look at technology and knowledge transfer. How much has Africa benefited from Chinese or Russian technology? Going by what is happening, we've seen the Germans were here. When you go to a day, you see German structure still standing there. They have so many of them. In Boya, you have so many structures which may have served as somehow symbolic in learning how these things are done. But we understand that China, to some extent, became who they are because of technology that they got from especially the US and Japan, and also from Europe. How much technology have you seen Africa actually tapping out of the Chinese and the Russians to develop themselves?
Yeah, a very important question. I think the point should not be always to tap from others to develop them, to develop ourselves, but to tap from ourselves to develop ourselves.
Okay.
Because the reality is this: technology for what? To be the big question. Do Africa lack technology? And I've argued this personally from the perspective that we must look at what we have and only close the gaps of what we don't have. If you look at our mothers in communities today, if you ask them what they need, they don't need trillions of dollars. They want to add value to the food with their cassava. And a simple solar dryer that youth in communities could be able to use local material to fabricate. That's the kind of technology we need that can be accessible to over 1 billion people in the continent who don't have opportunity. When you look at clean energy, People will tell you that we should be able to be talking about gas, but how many mothers in communities will be able to afford cook stoves? Then we can be able to engage you to produce fuel briquettes, which are made out of household waste, to then be able to replace charcoal. That can be accessible by over 900 million Africans who are energy impoverished. The point I'm trying to make here is that if we only wait to get technology from others to transform and to give them high five that they've done well, then that is a thing of the past. And I think what Dr. Ndimancho said, talking about servant leadership, is something that needs to be taught in school. And congratulations, Mr. Liu, and to my media prime, for having the conversation on the mindset change, engaging the young people. Because the truth is this: we are having this discussion in a continent that is over 60% youthful. The problem is that these young people should actually be the focus, because if their mindset, like what Dr. Ako talked about, there is profound power in a narrative. Profound power in a narrative, that if that narrative is not leveraged to make Africans, regardless of whether they're old or young, to see that, look, for quite a very long time, what we have been told has not been right. Narrative make people to do what they do, sometimes knowing what they'll get out of it. Then we're in a deep. Therefore, soft power here is even more than military power. Soft power is narrative, that you are told what to do, you do it without even knowing what you will get out of it. You think that you're going to be better off, and at the end of the day, you're not better off. We are told that you don't need to add value to what you produce, that if you export raw materials, you are going to become rich. Not true. You are told that though you have minerals, you should not be able to look, how do you add value to those minerals? And that partnerships you should get should have clear demarcation and terms that you cannot be able to export any mineral from a country unless 60% of those citizens, and especially young people, have actually been taught on how to develop and use technology to mine minerals, whether it is chromium or lithium. This is the kind of thing that needs to happen. And that way, technology will be useful, because even if technology is given to all African countries, do we have those who can be able to maintain it? Take out the roads. It is a lot of time. Yes, we skyscrapers on excellent roads. We construct those roads. When the roads get spoiled, we have the engineers in place in our own countries to repair the roads. It's not the immediate optics that matter. It's what can be sustainable. And therefore, the technology from country good, but technology should be coming to fill in a country and build a capacity, the young people to be able to produce the technology, fabricate the technology. But we should look internally and say, what do we have that can address the challenges of our mothers and brothers and sisters in communities, can be produced internally, incentives that can then get the young people to start becoming very active. And just the last point, which is self-control sometimes is not always forced down on people. When people do not accept that they need to sometimes endure short-term pain before long-term gain, then we see ourselves where we are today. The young people, some of them work so hard. Today, this idea of benevolence and aid and freebies creates an entitlement that we start to see that flags are put up for others just because we are thinking through the lens of what is going to be in it for us. If we start to make everyone know that we can get what we can get by working and looking internally and source for the enabling environment to be created, then definitely to have what we can have. And I can tell you that in the next 10, 15 years, we will see young people not really saying that much about who is coming to partner or not, but saying, how can we be able to get what we do to be closed, for the gap to be closed, regardless of where the partners come from? Over.
Yes, but Doctor, you talked about the fact that we should look at how to develop ourselves, and also questioning what to do with the technologies that we are expecting from other persons. But I want us to be a little bit practical. You see the sports complex, the Yaoundé Sports Complex, that was constructed by the Chinese. Till date, the electricity system of that complex is still being managed by the Chinese. I don't know what contract they signed, but it is still being managed by the Chinese. I remember one day going to the Limbe Omnisport Stadium. I was in the entourage of the governor of the Southwest region who went inspecting. I'm sure at the time the nation was preparing for the Nations Cup, and when it came to testing the lights. Nobody could do that, and the governor was surprised, and he asked why it was impossible for those the black guys around, our brothers. They said only the Chinese have competence to do this, and that they were not around until they come. How do we explain this? Is it the fact that we have refused to take control of these things, or we are also imposed that we are constructing these things, but at some point we are the ones to handle certain aspects?
Very important question, Mr. Leo. I think it touches back to what I said, and this is very, very key. When you are given things just for whether they're through loans and you are not the one who take charge in carrying out the real activity, then definitely you'll be left out. And that's what I keep saying. This technology is not free. It's been sold. And even when it is sold, it is not given to the country. So the point should then be, instead of building that stadium and installing the machines that were there, what is wrong in entering an agreement to have Cameroonians trained to be able to develop the very technology or to install and manage the technology, so that when something goes wrong, it is a Cameroonian or a Nigerian, if it was Nigeria or in Kenya or in Uganda, to be able to do that. And that is why I said that if we are not careful, the development in Africa we see through the lens of partners alone. Who those partners do for the African continent with Africans? Institutionalizing and Africanizing the technology to make meaning and to be handled by the Africans, then it will just be hot air. Why do I say so? Because then, if there is going to be a stadium to build, the workforce, not just from the perspective of molding bricks or this, the washing, the technology installation, a chunk of Africans and Cameroonians should be trained to be able to handle that. So it goes down to the point of what a country needs and what they must be able to do to ensure sustainability. If not, when I talk about bridges, roads being constructed, are they constructed by Africans? No. When the bridges break down or the roads get spoiled, will we have the engineers to do so? So the point, therefore, from a very practical perspective, is government should be African-led, must be Africanized. What I mean by Africanization is that it's not every technology that needs to come from abroad. It's called patents. And sometimes even technology that you use, you can never produce it because you do not have the license or to be able to do so. And so the more we continue consuming these things without producing them, we end up where we are today.
Okay, thank you very much. Doctor from Canada talks about technology. We are waiting to get from outside. Permit me say this technological change has to be looked into. We don't give value to the ones we have in our nation. Then what should we expect? I know an individual whose technological display could bring a change to our economy, yet it was discouraged and refused. Daniel is writing them. Yes, there are benefits. Yes, there are benefits we get from them and so forth. But our governments are actually doing their best, but there is an influence that these guys are bringing over nations and territory. The earlier the leaders begin to rethink, the better, okay? Good evening to you. Greetings. Until African countries stamp out selfishness, political barbarism, and hatred, we will continue to sink in poverty, begging wars, economic devastation, and death. Ngola David is writing from Bamenda. Good evening, Mr. Liu. Some African countries are becoming wise and taking the ideology of Gaddafi of one Africa and gold market. Underground tension between Russia, China, and America makes us to foresee a world war that would totally lead to Africa's liberty and breakthrough in production and international trade sector. No currency in Africa is well known out of Africa, but we know of the dollars, euros, and pounds. May God help Africa liberate us. Akpango is writing from Boya. Good evening to you. Good evening, Mr. Leonard and the fellow panelists. I think Africa is in dire need of unity at this time. Mr. Liu, it is really frustrating that after English, French, Spanish, etc. has divided Africa this much, the Chinese are now coming with their own language to our universities, but Swahili is not taught in any of these universities. What feature do Africans really have in these countries? Do Africans leaders really see this continent after 100 years? I think the worst mistakes is depending on Europeans and their peers for favors. I salute the efforts of Professor Lumumba on these issues, but I think it's time the civil society leaders around Africa start talking to this government. Mr. Golof is writing from Bamenda. Good evening to you, Mr. Golof. Good evening, Mr. Liu and Dr. Ako. Dr. Ako, the case of Cameroon is pathetic. Even Equatorial Guinea and Gabon, that Cameroon can today dispose Cameroonians, okay? No Western or Asian investment in Africa is for free. They may pretend with policy, but in long run, they will rob the continent. When African leadership understand that the best investment is in development and capacitation of their youth, then the continent will remain a tool of manipulating and exporting the continent. Our leadership should start to understand that until they start believing that only Africans can solve the problem of Africa, they shall always be given the place of a slave. The African government should create universities and curriculum whose research should be addressing African societal problems. Dr. John Asong is writing from Mafikek. Stephen Mwambo says the bigger error Africa is making is to run away from the demon to embrace another demon. It's a shame Africans are realizing how terrible slavery was, then colonization and then new colonization. And instead of building stronger bonds among sister African nations, we are instead embracing China and Russia with even bigger hidden stakes. Remember, China built the African Union building in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and they implanted equipment to spy and transmit every information discussed in that building and transmit to savers in China. Africa must not be servants and beggars in our international. Good evening, Mr. Liu, and your panelists in the studio. Mr. Liu, you have brave men on your panel. Good job. Africans are highly indebted to these foreign countries in exchange for their natural resources. So it will a breach of contracts to change your supplier or getting other business partners without repaying the debts. Caleb is writing from Bamenda. Yes, you are reading of our relationship with China and Russia.
I'll look at it from two perspectives. First, cultural perspective, and second, leadership perspective.
Okay.
And if you see, the greatest deficit we have in Africa is leadership. We have a great deficit of leadership. And the culture and politics has a great role to play when it comes to embracing Russia and China. Russia and China will want to do business with you without minding, without interfering with your culture, without interfering with your religion, without interfering with your leadership style and techniques. And so, therefore, the West will want to invest in your country or do business with you by dictating how you run your political structure, by determining how you get your culture, your religion. And so, therefore, the African person, ordinary African, will not like to embrace homosexuality. Also, the African leader will not want to embrace homosexuality. So the African man who doesn't want homosexuality will see Russia and China as being the best. And so will not bother very much about its leadership structure. Whereas the Russian on their part, the Americans on their part, will want to do business with you, will determine that you must do it this way and this way. A while ago, 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, the Vice President of America, Kamala Harris, was in Africa for an African visit where she visited Ghana, Zambia, and some African nations. And the reason was because they wanted to send her as a forerunner for U.S. policy in preview to the BRICS summit, which is coming in August, such that she can pitch the U.S. position in preview to the BRICS summit in August. Now, she went to this country, and all through she went to this country, there was a question that she had that was asked to Hakindele, the president of Zambia, where I've forgotten that his name.
No, that video is misleading. It was that.
No, you have not gotten the question. The question was where he was talking about the fact that they should not. A journalist asked that, do you want to do business with China? Are you not going against the U.S. policy? And the president was clear about it. The president said they should not consider them doing business with China as being against U.S. policy or doing business with U.S. as being against China's policy. And he said that they are doing business with either U.S. or China for the best interest of their people, and they are not against the U.S. and they are not against China. This was a question asked by a U.S. journalist, whereas Kamala Harris was there because they wanted to know. The idea was that China is coming into Zambia, and we have seen China great investment in Zambia. So when they asked him, he told the journalist and the vice president that we are not against U.S. and we are not against China. So U.S. should not see us doing business with China as being against them. And a similar question was asked to Akufo when Kamala Harris was in Ghana, that you are doing business with China and Russia. How do you see you are doing business with U.S. adversaries? And he also was clear that they are not against U.S. and U.S. should not see them against them. And now the question of LGBT was also brought on the table, where Kamala Harris said the U.S. policy is based on respect of democracy and they see LGBT as a human right. And so therefore now, the African leader, an African ordinary Ghanaian, will not want to embrace homosexuality. And we see Russia and China, who should say they are coming to do business with you without pushing you to do your culture or transgenderism as a better devil. And so it has a cultural implication and it has also a political implication. If you look at what we are saying here, none of these persons are better. Let's look at Libya. Libya, in its dictatorship as we claim it was more stable. Its democracy was far better than what we have today. Libya is in disarray. But who brought what we had in Libya? NATO, by the West. Let's go to Afghanistan. Let's go to Cuba. Let's look at all these other countries that have been invaded by the West. It will still boil down to the same accusation we are labeling against Russia and China. Let's not forget that Russia stood firm for South Africa when it came to apartheid. Russia has been a long partner for Africa. Within the period of Soviet Union, Russia fought with Zimbabwe. MSC Mnangagwa was alongside with Vladimir Putin, where they were fighting. So a lot of things have not been told about the African history, and in such a way that people tend to buy the propaganda mechanism. In all of this, I go back to what John Henry Clark, a famous African-American Pan-Africanist, said. He said that when when African continent had their independence, the problem they had was that they mimic the structure of the colonial masters, and that is what they are feeling. And I agree with the panelist, Dr. Richard, that we cannot empower Africa by borrowing technology. We can empower Africa by creating boot camps, bring the best of minds of African students, put them in a boot camp, give them funding. They would invent. Look at what is happening in Kenya as we speak. Kenya is about to launch their satellite, purely built by Kenyan engineers, and the satellite will be launched in the coming week. And these are things that people should come together and they empower them. Conclusively, what I want to say here is that neither the West or America is of good deal. But however, the African man in his context is looking at its culture, transgenderism and homosexuality, and with that temper with their structure, the leaders should not have a problem with that.
Okay, you said the African man, it appears he is a European, and doctor, they are all Europeans? Because you are talking on behalf of...
No, I'm saying that based on what I've seen, that a true African man will not buy the idea of someone coming to do business with you, bringing LGBT as a condition. And that's why you see Africans tend more to most African leaders and nations. Look at what happened in Ghana. Ghana rose up, backed their president against LGBT, supporting Russia. So if you see most of the, I want to a bit differ with what Dr. Agu said, that most of these flags with these young men are being manipulated. If you move down to the street with a microphone, a lot of people will celebrate Russia, even without being manipulated. Yeah. People have their own opinion.
Yep. We are talking about declining influence of France and the West. And we are looking at whether these guys are an alternative. There was no tension. It was not a debate between healing these other guys and these guys. That is the normal argument that is around the quarters, where people say, oh, America has done this and that. We are looking at whether they are better. We are looking at profiling, because you just raised a point here that, okay, Russia fought with these guys, they are propaganda. I'm not doing propaganda here, please. We are talking about practical aspects. Russia is doing business with Africa today, they are in Central African Republic, they're in Mali. And yes, practically speaking, what has Russia done to help these nations?
If we look at what happened in Mali, Russia came when the war was already in Mali, so we cannot assess Russia on the reality of Mali now, because Mali, the war in the Sahel region in Mali was before Russia's assistance. So Russia is running because the Malian leaders decided that identify where they thought the problem was coming and want to look for an alternative solution to resolve
in Central African Republic, they are also there?
Now in Central African Republic, a similar situation. If you look at like Congo and the Central African Republic, these countries have long been in turbulence since before Russia actually is coming. So these are leaders that are struggling now to see alternative route for peace. We cannot weigh where we can weigh Russia now.
If I get what you said here is that, okay, the West is bringing us homosexuality and a host of others. So Russia and China are the better alternatives. That is what you said.
Yeah, based on why the influence is going to Russia, based on why people are leaders tend to weigh on Russia, why Russia influence is gaining ground in Africa.
Okay, you think so, or is the availability of free cash for now, because they don't look into some of those things that he cited, that before we give you money, we want you to respect this and that?
Yeah, somewhere I told you that the Russian-Chinese spirit grew up presently because of the conflict in Ukraine. Which means if Ukraine has been 2 years, the war in Mali might have been 2 or 3 years too. Now, when you find in Central African Republic, it's the same fight. One thing which I am saying here, which we need to see, is whether the West came to Africa with weapons of mass destruction. That is how they conquer Africa, to fight and defeat another person. This is not the idea we are preaching here. One of the things we need to know is that within the period that Africans have been using mere politics of cultural values, it's just one aspect. You have the church in Africa, which people don't know. Somewhere you will be told that Africans have been to Vatican. Some Africans are going to Mecca. Others will be going to China for Buddhism very soon, because Buddhism may become now another religion now accepted in Africa. So we should be expecting that. So which means that the same people, Chinese and Russians, have not told us that there is a new African church where we preach now our own African values. And somewhere I said that if they cannot give us an education that is equivalent to ours, and they still bring by their own technology, like the question you asked to Dr. Richard, then it is just a waste of time. It's simply changing, dressing a wolf in a sheep clothing, and it will not change the game plan. Africans need things which can solve their problem. You talking homosexuality, we talk IMF, we talk World Bank, but you're equally sure that they have equally created their own bank.
Yes.
The BRICS Bank is coming,
yes, and
it will not be a charitable bank. You will not go there and they give you money for free. But what I have known,
the question I'd like to ask is whether Exim Bank dashes money out.
That is, let's consider it's a Chinese bank, and that is what got us to the 72 billion computer, which I was asking, was that money given to Cameroon, or was it paid to the company? To whose company? And who took the money? You promised us a loan, 75 billion. We don't touch the money. You look for the provider of the computer in your country and you pay him the money there. Of what interest was that contract to us? So somewhere, the Chinese are coming. Africa should instead be liberal and free to make convention, not under constraint of whosoever or whatsoever. In the light of interest, we are free to negotiate. This is what we are praying here. African freedom, African liberty, moral consciousness, the respect for one another first as an African before we even get to the West. What are Africans doing? The intellect and a lot of schools in China, Russia, Japan, and the rest is that these people are poor people. Every time you go with small money, they give you a huge portion of their land and you manage. And us, some of the leaders, we have presented it as hunger-seeking Africans, which means that somewhere we know that China will bring us loans, and so we'll take the loans. Who will pay? How will we pay it? When are we paying? We don't even know.
Yeah, but at least they give us without conditions.
Yes, they give us without
what are the conditions? What are you meaning?
Condition. For example, what I was saying is, doctor, is that The loan that sometimes you receive from the West, they tell you that, okay, this comes with certain human rights values that you must respect. But the Exxon Bank and the Russian will not consider about whether you are a dictator, whether you are, whatever you are doing in your country.
And now
what they care is
good. You look at,
can pay their money. So the African man,
you take the money.
Yeah, you kill your people.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes. No, you are coming really to it.
You take the money.
That's what. Yes.
Everybody.
That's why Russia and China doesn't care about their policy. So our African leaders who are greedy, and also no.
Jarvis, we are teaching. Jarvis, we are teaching. There is no loan. Even those your family members who come to take loan from you, that you give them the money without a condition.
No, you are not understanding.
Yet we are getting you.
There's a loan bank condition attached to some social conditions that you must fulfill. For example, I just exercised.
You are talking of LTT. That is not the loan. It's not the loan condition for loans.
No, just a loan condition.
Yeah, what you don't accept. And what I love with Africans, Mr. Leonard, we should be very honest to ourselves. These guys understood the African mentality that a common picture and video can destabilize all our thoughts, even our own basic and origin, where we are going, where we are coming from. They took a photo and took a propaganda of homosexuality. African claims of it as not of Chinese origin. But we have forgotten, like somebody said here, the Minister of Defense signed a convention with the Chinese at the height of war, Russian to Cameroon, to fight who? We should equally ask that if China or Russia should sign a contract when Cameroonians are fighting among themselves, are we doing good to ourselves by signing such a convention because there are no conditions? When you look at nations that have become strong partners to these nations we call the BRICS, you will understand that dictatorship is one. Those who want to cling them to power, we don't have problem with you. Is this what we want? Is this what we want for an African with a vision of growing? Let's look at nations where there is alternative in governance. Are they more successful than tyranny that has been in power?
I want us to understand. You say China does not care whether you are a dictator or not.
They don't care to
Okay,
interfere.
let me come now. France is working with Chad. The father dies.
The son took over.
And fully backed by France. France is doing good business with Cameroon. I don't know whether France has asked the president to leave. They are doing business with the president of Equatorial Guinea, who is there. France is doing business with the guy in Congo, Denis Sassou Nguesso. I don't know how. Did they ask somebody to leave?
Well, you should know that these are diplomatic relationships, and there is no permanent enemy, no permanent friend, but it's a permanent interest. What you hope to, and what Africans they need to know is that France will not come and actually pity you, your situation, more than their own people.
What they need?
Yeah, what they need. That France, they are coming for purely business. For their interest and business, trying to play in interest. Issue of diplomacy to Carrefour is not their problem. So don't expect, even if Pobia or whoever is in a wheelchair and ruling, and France is a mission is guaranteed. What is their problem? They have no issue with that. America has the biggest embassy, they have constructed in Cameroon, the biggest embassy in Africa. Do you know why the interest they have by constructing that biggest embassy in Africa here in Yaoundé? It's because of their interest in the Gulf of Guinea. It is about interest. They do not care. When they sent military here, when we had the Boko Haram, and many people even complained that some military, that it was not to come and give us, and as if they love Cameroonians so much. They know exactly what they are looking for, and these are some of the things that we should describe, Mr. Liu. We said it should be something win-win, and you only do something win and respect somebody when you think that person can compete with you actually in a fair ground. Now, but when you find the president of Cameroon who is sick, or any African president sick, he goes to Europe for treatment. You find the minister's children, all of them, they study abroad. In Europe. You find that when we need construction work in Cameroon, we bring labor from outside. Do you think that these people will treat you, or even they say Russia African summit, do you really think that they are coming for that summit, that Russia Africa? Even the fact that it's even Russia as a country, it still looks at Africa as a very, very, very low level, because they think that the whole Africa put together cannot compete with Russia. Because how would they compete with you? You don't have any hospital. Every day you find your ministers coming, or your president coming here. Every day the students are going there. They are giving scholarships. They announce scholarship in Cameroon. This country has given scholarship, and you find people scrambling to get for scholarship. You find all of our children, we are dying in the sea. And the images are viral in the world. They say, look at these people from the dark continent. I even remember there's a journalist who said Russia is joining the race to the dark continent. And in the 21st century, a journalist made that statement. Then you should understand where we are coming from. And there is a school of thought, even the fact that, and I said it here, that we should be talking about how China is coming to Cameroon or to Africa. What solution? What do we gain? What does the population as a whole gain from that? But we have realized that it is rather the leaders that are gaining, because China is coming with arms deal to help the leaders to be able to massacre the people and push them not to speak out. I mean, you find that the African youths are emerging youths, and there are people, their voices need to be heard, and they are expressing themselves now. Many African presidents are making it sure that people don't talk any longer, and that the only way to put them down is to use arms. And you realize that, go to any African country now, you have your CFA. I mean, I was in Nigeria the other week. You have CFA, you don't change to Naira. But show $1 to anybody in Nigeria, they fall in front of you because it is $1. What kind of thing is that? This is the way our mentality is. Our mentality is such a way that we do not yet know exactly that we are people. I mean, we still have that mentality of the West, that they think that we are, I mean, monkeys or whatsoever. We do not measure ourselves. We minimize our competencies, and that is what we need to measure up now, and to say that we have to put things in a context. There is this issue about Pan-Africanism. I mean, I'm doing a story on it now, Black Consciousness Movement. You will even realize that those who even talk about the ears and say we need to reassert the African identity, they are the very people who go and die in Europe. They are the people who favor European issues. They are the people who want European style of life. Even starting from the 1960. Look at people like Sédar Senghor, who was even the president of Senegal up to 1971. And he is regarded as one of the negritude fathers. Where did he die? He died in France. I mean, so we have a mentality that we need to work on. We need to take it to the laboratory and be able to work on, so that we come out really, I mean, with that power. We put things in the African context and see. Dr. Richard said it very recently and said, what do we want? Do we need the technology we are opting for? If we need it, yes, let us put it in the African context and see what technology is good for us. And when we don't ask for it, look at the Wuri Bridge. Who built the Wuri Bridge? I mean, they are the French people that built the Wuri Bridge, and they gave the price, and they had to pay the price because the Chinese even came with a lower bid, but they didn't give. But all of these things is about, I mean, that kind of diplomacy. And you know, countries install their embassy in other countries because of what they want to gain. It may not be something that favors the people. Sometimes it's just something that favors only the person who is at the top. Okay. And then you find that embassy is planted.
Dr. Richard Munang, so many Africans are also of the idea of expressed here by Tamai Jarvis, that they would prefer to deal with the Russians and the Chinese because they come with loans and assistance without necessarily placing very tough conditions on us. Is that the best way to grant our loans without ensuring how these loans are going to be used?
Yeah, thanks again, Mr. Liu, and to the panelists and Jarvis for your point. Let me start with this point that Dr. Ndimancho has mentioned. Nothing is free. Let me repeat that again. There is no free loan. And in the world of diplomacy, it's about interest. And if somebody gives you something for free, you need to ask yourself, what is that person going to get in return? And unless we start to have this in mind, that in partnership, there is a give and take, and it must be a win-win. If we do not ask that question as Africa and as states, then definitely there is something very, very wrong. And it goes back to that original point. There's nothing like free loans. Loans are given through taxpayers in one country, and those taxpayers' loans need to be accountable for. So you cannot tell me that a country is bringing loans to Cameroon at low interest rate and they don't care how they're going to be used. No, it's a false narrative. It's counted for the donor, the country that gives it, or by banks in those countries. And therefore, when that resources or those resources are given to any country in the African continent, and the mindset of the narrative that no, this is not with stringent rules, so it's a better now, that is supposed to be questionable. And therefore, the point should be, if anyone anywhere in the world give a country something, whether it is technology or it is loans at low interest rate, it is not free. And the country should then be able to ask the question, what are we leveraging this for, and how can we then better use it so that at least we can maximize, pay back those loans, knowing that at least that loan has worked for our country. Until we reach that level of thinking, to first of all graduate from freebies and benevolence and thinking that aid is free, we will continuously get used to that very word again. Actually, being in position of authority, as Dr. Ndimancho said, not the solidarity level. Because at solidarity level, you are given. Once you are given, even you cannot think where opportunities that you have will be taken away from. And therefore, to say that partnerships engagement with others should be based just on what they give that is acceptable and easier for us is actually a very wrong place of development. Go to the last point, which was we should look internally this simple question: what is the strategy for every country towards any partner, whether it is west or east, north or south? How does it benefit the country through the lens of trade? Because that is the only way you can become dependent, you can become prosperous, you can engage your citizens so that at least you engage them to add value to what is there. Let me just give a very practical example here. During COVID, 2 years ago, 5% of all the technologies that were produced by African citizens and mostly the young people. Whether it was oxygen machines or it was material that was actually protective gear. How many African countries did reject this and did buy into this? Today we don't even hear about these technologies. To the point that even the loans we are looking for, there are certain things that could be done with very limited resources in the continent to generate opportunities and actually resources that can actually drive development forward. To think that loans are a favor and because the low interest rate is a good thing to do, it's only a trap that even our children's children will not be able to pay. You cannot develop by using loans not to invest in what can bring you more returns on investment. It's not about building big bridges or building long roads, but using those loans can fetch you more money, value to a mineral. We're speaking today, Cameroon actually have a reserve of cobalt, which is actually going to be one of the minerals that will drive this e-mobility that I mentioned. We talk DRC, cobalt, the biggest in the entire world. The next politics, as we will see coming in as I'm speaking now, Mr. Luo, is the politics of critical minerals. Who will benefit? Have the skill sets to be able to add value to this mineral? No, we do not. Women that currently discussed at the moment having a caveat there that the local young people should be trained to be able to mine this. No, that should be the center stage. If not, Africa will be left behind this time around, not like it was before, but left with nothing.
Thank you very much, and we are going to be ending here. I don't know whether we should do another debate to focus on how Africa should actually engage with Russia and China as new partner alternatives for the continent. Julius Chofo writes again says, what a fantastic program, Mr. Leo. There were some eye-opening contributions from all the panelists. My take-home message is that Africa has to put in place the infrastructure to trade with itself, road links, air routes, common currency. When we look at the pathetic example of the lighting in the Limbe Stadium, we must not forget that there are fantastic structures in both Limbe and Boya that were put up in the 50s and 60s by homegrown companies that no longer exist. We did it before. We can do it again. Thank you very much, Julius Chofo, writing there from the UK. Doctor, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Mr. Leo. It's a pleasure. And we think that we'll be able to tell a good story for Africa as the future shows to be bright.
Okay. Some African leaders are just puppets used by the set countries to suppress their youth, who are supposed to be the innovative minds of the growth of the nation, and because the leaders are selfish and self-centered, they easily fall prey to the baby traps. This question, in my own view, is like denying Peter to accept Paul. They are twins with different strategies. Cameroonians have programmed their minds to believe that nothing good can be made in this country by a Cameroonian. Example is the electric car made by a Cameroonian in Cameroon, with controversies online about it, and the government isn't even taking it into consideration to grow this idea. Thank you for coming, Dr. Ako.
Yeah, Mr. Leonard, it's a pleasure. One time again, it's good to tell Africans there is a reality that the system of education has been a problem. Others have taken Africans to laboratories and have studied them well. That is why the Chinese and the Russians have a different approach to the Americans and the Europeans. Can Africans study themselves and know what they need? There is research and development. If we can't go to school and we are unable to develop ourselves, then what is the agenda of such an academic setting? We need to start studying Africa and how to develop Africa, not learning world history to see the history that they impoverish us, and not how we can empower ourselves.
Okay. It's what Julius Fosun, writing from Kumba, says it's an error to compare the West and Russia and China. In Europe and the US, no matter their shortcomings, they are accountable to their parliament and have human aspects in their dealings. Russia and China are sinking and looking for the people to sink with them. Good evening to you. Good evening, Prem. Very knowledgeable content from Jarvis. Lots of facts and realities put together from his content. For me, Africa should be responsible for her every progress. Too much shadowing from these Western invasions, from currency to banking, technology, culture, etc. Mr. Ewane is writing from St. Francis in Kumba. This one says, please read my text. Let me do that. Greetings to you all. I really thank you for this topic. We will always remain slaves to the West so far as we don't encourage our own. Africans are very talented, but our leaders are the problem. Lazarus Ayum is writing from Limbe. Like the case you cited in Limbe Stadium, we have talented electrical engineers that can handle that, and I know them in the Southwest region. Okay. Good evening, Mr. Liu and the panel members. I'm decking in Bamenda. My humble opinion is that I prefer Russia and China. These people would rather encourage Africans to value and develop what was lost and find Africa as a place to stay, though no one knocks on your door without his or her personal interest in his or her forehead. Thank you for coming, Jarvis.
Thank you very much, and I want to conclude by saying that Africa has no shortage of peer review. What Africa lack is leadership. Africa, the greatest problem in Africa is deficit on leadership. The moment we have the right leadership, the rest will fall in place.
We want to thank all of you guys for coming. Doctor, thank you too for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Liu, for having me, and thanks to the panelists. I mean, the ideas were quite very brilliant. And I would just like to say this, which I started off with, is Africa needs to leverage soft power at the moment, because the narrative sometimes make Africa impoverished, though we are not impoverished. And we must tap our youth to retool their skills. Like every member have said in the discussion today, we have everything it takes to be ahead, but we are just so comfortable at the solidarity level, and we must be able to take authority by showing that this is what we can offer. And for that to happen, we must self-believe, become servant leaders, because without servant leadership, we may never have the leaders that Africa actually needs today. And this needs to start from our schools, where servant leadership needs to become a course, institutionalized from primary school right up to the university level. And that simply means selflessness. I don't do anything because I have to gain in it. I do it because it can benefit each and everyone. And I think today in every African school, this is not being taught, but yet we are told that leadership, it's about someone who is sitting somewhere and controlling a country. No, it's personal responsibility. It's each and every one of us saying, wherever I am, to be able to do something that can benefit beyond my immediate family. And I think if we all embrace this, then anything that is being told, whether it is from the West, from the East, we will say, what have we done that we need others to come and help us? Until then, we will be somewhere.
Okay, until then, we'll be somewhere like Dr. Richard Munang says. Thank you to you, Desmond and Eli, for production, Tabi Tambebrian for supervision. Thank you all for watching. Stay blessed. Bye-bye.
Welcome to a new world of TV broadcasting. My Major Prime.